What's that Fry meme again? You know, like shocked, but not that shocked. Yeah, that's my feeling with Gen.G. Welcome to Vision Denial. My name is Sam, and if you're new here, I've watched every single playoff game of every region the entire year long. Yes, including that one. There is coverage for the entirety of Worlds on a weekly basis, as well as a review of every single one of the series and matches. I put them up on my TikTok, which is linked down below. We are going to be talking about the quarterfinals. And oh boy, emotions and intensities are high with everything that went on. Quite frankly, there is quite a bit of confusion and situations regarding the expected results. Some were very much 100% expected and on the nose. Others were a little bit more surprising. And less about the scoreline and more about the actual play itself. We say goodbye to NRG. We say goodbye to Gen.G. We say goodbye to KT Rolsters, and we say goodbye to LNG Esports. What a set of teams to say goodbye to. But before we go into that and some of my thoughts regarding the change of even the meta still being super flexible, which is really, really cool in the way that it's flexible, and anything else so much more, let's take a look first at all of the series that went off during the quarterfinals. And we're back with... It's the quarterfinals, the first one. We got ourselves the first seed from North America's LCS NRG versus the fourth seed of China's LPL Weibo Gaming. And, oh man, part of this was such a disappointment. But in terms of individual showing, it was rather rough from NRG. Regardless of what we expected from them, they still showed us some solid vision play, some great coordination, and a proper understanding of their win conditions. Meanwhile, Weibo here have shown excellent preparation for this series, clearly attacking some of the rough edges out of NRG, holding incredible vision play, solid neutrals, and adaptation from game to game that is necessary for this stage. NRG also got the chance to show some forms of adaptation between games, but it came at a 2-game loss. And with that, what looked like such a mental drain from them. Now, Weibo, for their part, looked invigorated and prepared, especially for any given matchup, but there are still some concerns that are about their consistency. This is, however, still the most consistent we've seen them all year. My MVP for the series goes to Light, who managed to influence all 3 games so dramatically. God, he was unstoppable. And we're back with bracket stage with the quarterfinals. We got the first seed from Korea's LCK, Gen.G, versus the second seed from China's LPL, Bilibili Gaming. And, oh man, it was an almost reverse sweep. Now, okay, let's start with the honest truth and constant reminder from the disappointment that is from, Gen.G here, okay? But it's really never as simple as they just didn't deliver or they didn't read their opponents correctly. There's something fundamental that was at cause here. From their inconsistent vision approach to their lackadaisical coordination and really just the straight-up disrespect shown so frequently. Gen.G played like they knew they should have won, but instead we wind up with a team who didn't know how to win. On the flip side, Bilibili properly adapted game to game and had incredible vision, some solid neutrals, coordination for days. It became very clear that Bilibili was looking more like their summer season selves, but that's just it. their earlier rounds don't compare to the teams who, know how to handle them. And it's just a matter of seeing if they can keep up this particular momentum in the future rounds, or if they're just going to lose it like they did in their playoffs. Did I say how fantastic their vision was? Because holy crap, it was really good. My MVP of this particular series is Shun for the amount of pressure he put on Gen.G everywhere at all stages. Why did they let him have Jarvan for 5 full games? And we're back with another quarters within Worlds. We've got ourselves the 3rd seed from Korea's LCK, KT Rolsters, versus the champion, or the tournament favorites, 1st seed from the LPL, JD Gaming. And quite honestly, KT, take a bow. You really had me in games 1 and 4 because this is an incredible performance. No one expected the series to be as close as it was, and this is saying a lot given that it was a 3-1 score. Now, KT had solid understanding of their win conditions, were well prepared for this matchup, some of the strongest vision play all tournament long, incredible coordination, and frankly, this is the best they have played all year long. And it's just a shame that they played so well against JD Gaming, because it's JD Gaming who, despite given any stage of the game, looked unfazed against them. It's kind of baffling to see a team that will be just okay playing behind in the early to mid to late game, so long as the deficit isn't 10 plus K, just to be able to out macro, out micro, out team fight, outplay neutral setups for victories. And in the exact same vein, the vision and coordination are just out of control. This is the first game that JD Gaming loses its entire tournament, but out of all the best of 5s this year, they have never come close to losing a best of 5. And this continues my expectations that JD Gaming just look unstoppable. My MVP for this particular series is Missing, who facilitated vision, engage, and disruption to a point that is near impossible to replicate. And we're back with the last quarterfinals of Worlds, the 3rd seed of LPL's LNG Esports versus the 2nd seed from Korea's LCK, T1. And absolute shock is the sensation I have from this series. To me, this was the closest matchup in the quarterfinals, and anyone who thought there was going to be a lean from one team or to the other would have been justified given the level of play both of these teams have had so far. But this is something else. Despite the coordination, the level of vision play, the understanding of their win condition from LNG, T1 showed better application of all of those core play and better preparation and adaptation. Honestly, the adaptation also hurt a lot from LNG because they seemed incapable to find the correct answers during drafts and in-game for what T1 had in store for this series. Now, T1 often have a buff during international play, and especially at Worlds, but every single member in this series, every single member of this team decided to overperform to a degree that is unfathomable. The remaining teams have to sweat from here on out. My MVP of this particular series is Owner for how much he nullified LNG's early game. God, this series is crazy. Right. So, with that, the series themselves were always a little bit of a surprise in some sense. Like the Weibo versus NRG series, I'm surprised that there was so little fight that was put up by NRG, especially as they were doing so much better as the tournament was going on. There'd be a little bit more competition, and it wasn't really there. The Gen.G versus KT Rolsters. KT did such an incredible job at showcasing how good they can be, but of course it's still JD Gaming, so that was the expected result. Gen.G faltering against Bilibili is like a little surprising in terms of expectations that they were not gonna falter again at the quarters, but here we are. But Bilibili was still a team that had the most amount of consistency up until their playoffs in summer. So that's the only little hump that they had all year. So it doesn't surprise me that they've kept up the consistency since then. And then the really banger of the series of like the whole thing, the T1 versus LNG Esports. And I mentioned last week that this was going to be like if you're going to vote for either side, this would be like a coin flip of like 60-40, either go. T1 proved that this was not at all like a 50-50 matchup in some sort or even a close competition. This was so one-sided. Holy crap. That was 100% the series of the week. And that specific series encapsulates a nice view of the shift that's going on with the meta at this moment. But before we talk about that, I do want to acknowledge the teams one by one real quick. Let's start with LNG Esports. Or, they're not Energy. Let's start with Energy here. The North American representatives did an excellent job at qualifying for the quarterfinals. Say what you want about which teams they drew against, they still had to face off at least one significant team. It wasn't just easy road the entire way. The Swiss stage is not designed that way. And even if they got the easier draw, there was a possibility with the improvements that they had that this rematch, so to speak, would be better for them. Not necessarily a guaranteed win. There's still a huge expectation that Weibo was going to win. But it becomes a little unfortunate that this is how it ended for them. Because I was very fond of the new style that they were molding and shaping for the tournament. And it looked like they just forgot it would be the more appropriate term. And it's super unfortunate because you could tell from their faces that like the frustration had been set and they had already lost not the will to keep going, but they lost their mental cool on it all. And so there was like a sort of background sense of, oh, we've resigned ourselves to a loss. We come back next year and maybe we make semifinals, or maybe we even make like something of the sorts, right? But we don't know if they're going to play together again. It could be the last time that this roster is the same roster as is. Rosters are kind of fickle in every region, so it's bound to see what goes on from there, which is, a saddening remark regarding the end of NRG's really monumental rise from change of organizations to a weird performance of their summer split to really solid meteoric play in playoffs to this run, which was an incredible run from them. It just is a little sad damper to the end of that continuous journey. Next, let's talk about LNG Esports. This is the team that I had genuinely the most amount of excitement for. There was like an acknowledgement that stats-wise and performance-wise all year, that Gen.G and Gen.G were like the top dogs at the tournament, and so expecting most any other team to win was mostly like some form of either fan base or there's an angle for it, or just like it's a little bit of hope as opposed to like a huge amount of backing data that could really solidly argument for yourself. LNG for most of the year would not have ever been considered contenders up until their playoff, and their playoff run showed such a close run-in with KT Gaming that to the point where when it came to Worlds, I was expecting a similar level in caliber, and we kind of got a taste for that. We got a little bit of a taste for that. And this particular series that they had to face and end with did not have the same kind of damper that it did with NRG, but they didn't ever show how dominant and solid, like how consistent they are at ballooning leads. They didn't show how great their coordination is or their ability to play around neutral objectives. There was something lost here. And whether or not it's because they were caught off guard by how ruthless and consistent, like dominating that T1 were, or just at the day they lost it completely, who knows? That would be like some retrospect in the history books of Sniff of like the tournament. It's just an unfortunate nature of there's been consistent disappointment with how people lose out in their quarterfinals, and they were no different here. Now let's talk about the consistent disappointment that is Gen.G. I don't really want to harp on this, right? People who view this historically, and I've talked about this also in terms last week, in terms of the expectations set going up against Bilibili, of how, yes, this team on paper, by all accounts, should be dominantly winning in this series. And yet, caveat on how historically Gen.G doesn't do well at Worlds. Not to, and I don't mean like, they don't do well relative to their expectations and their regular season performance. Because, let's be realistic, making consistently quarters or I think there's only one time, and it was in 2018, where they didn't make the bracket stage, and that was off of that wild Cloud9 Vitality Gen.G tiebreaker. That was quite a time. But other than that, they've consistently made the bracket stages every time that they've qualified for Worlds, and they're very good at qualifying for Worlds and performing at a high level for these particular events. The issue is that the type of high-level performance we expect from them does not translate past quarters. It does not. Heck, it doesn't even translate during quarters in many instances. Right? And, like, there's some historical revisits that you can do in terms of, like, who they faced off eventually wins Worlds, or who they faced off did way better than expected and everything else. But here's the problem, is that even if the performance of who they face off is better than expected, they should have been better, because their performance still doesn't match what was expected of them at that time. And I think there needs to be a retooling of their infrastructure internally if this keeps happening. You can't be content at making top 8 and that's it. Now let's talk about the high point of the teams that were eliminated. And then KT Rolsters, a team who regularly disappoints, where fans are expecting disappointment. And they showed up real big against JD Gaming, winning the first game in a way that shocked everybody. It was not even close in that first game. Regardless of how the rest of the series performed, and JD Gaming readjusted their strategy and expectations, and they really adapted super well. But that's how JD Gaming does. Every time they hit a loss, they bounce back so easily. KT really performed so well. This was the best I've seen this squad perform all year long. Quite point blank. This is the best I have seen them ever. And it would not shock me if we see this squad unchanged next year from this performance alone. It more likely that they don't stick together, but that's the nature of off-season. We don't know. I don't think anybody, even KT making top 8, was not at all at least it was an expectation, right? They were expected to make top 8 and not much more, right? The caliber of the teams going into the tournament, coupled with their very volatile inconsistencies, and the fact that they're very one note about how they perform very well in the early game and then not much else, really solidified the idea that top 8 was almost assured, but not much more. You shouldn't be expecting more. And the series that they played really pondered the question of, sure, we could posit if they faced NRG, they would probably do well in the semifinals, but the combinations of what ifs become well more exciting with KT than it does with the other 3 teams who got eliminated, because of how well they did against JD Gaming. And this will really solidify based off how every other team faces off against JD Gaming if they have even close to the same type of situations. This was a team that didn't sadden me, but excited me on the way that they were eliminated, because they went in with a they went out with a bang. It was such a good series. So my thoughts after this, outside of the large amount of disappointments that came from some of the teams and the nice excitement for the one team that got eliminated, was the way in which the meta for this tournament has transformed is quite simply incredible. Now, I can't necessarily credit the change in format. The change in format does a lot in terms of having to do a lot more more adaptations, more variety of different play. You're either going to get significantly more games than usual, or so many fewer games than usual. In which that, good or bad in any different direction, right? But it doesn't necessarily solidify the meta is going to change in the same way, because from play-ins to groups to bracket, the different stages of the tournament remain consistent in terms of how much the meta changes and how little of it does, right? You'll get introduction play-ins, and then there's a shift for solidification of what is this for sure works. And then bracket comes along, and then they do maybe slight changes and slight tweaks to really emphasize the matchups that they're going up against. Right? And that was the song and dance for nearly a decade, right? Ever since the introduction of wildcards, which is 2014? Is that right? Yeah, 2014, I believe. Yeah, 2014 would be the year. I guess with the wildcard tournament and then Worlds itself. From there on, that's been kind of the expectation of how this is supposed to work. Now, with the Swiss stage and teams having the chance to really mix and match based off of who they're expected to face off against, and really prioritize deferring strategies as opposed to homogenizing their meta, so to speak, because there isn't a set amount of teams that you're going to be facing. You're likely going to face any number of them depending on the draw, and you have very little time to prepare. It means that you had to have a wider pool of ideas for what the meta is going to look like. And that's cool. So why doesn't this work in other tournaments? Why doesn't this work in playoffs more often? Especially with the formats as they are, there's not a lot of time to prepare. You're going to be facing off against so many different teams. And I don't know. There was something really special about how, yeah, sure, we probably would have gotten a little bit more changes and a little bit more variety in this situation, but we went from such a mid lane focused to jungle and top focus to bot lane focus in a matter that was so fluid, and those three different focuses also changed nearly on an every 2 to 3 day basis, and that was pretty wild to actually see how solidly they nailed this patch. Just would have put it out there. They nailed the actual balancing of this particular patch. It feels so good. And I think it's really telling that they didn't... Usually, they talk about champion diversity as a broken record type situation, right? When you're looking at cumulative champion statistics, currently with 98 games played, there's only been 87 champions picked. When you compare that to last year, when there was 109, and there was significantly more games too. Jeez. And who knows? There could be 20 new champions at that point, but it feels a lot better this year in terms of the balance and flexibility and changes of the meta, because there isn't a focus on wildness and ability to do everything, and there's a more focused, narrow idea of flexibility for the matchup that you need. as opposed to just flexibility to defer from everything else. I just think that's a good thing to congratulate. And the fact that we got to see it at quarters means that much more, because we're gonna get significantly more of this during semis and at finals. These teams are already showing that there is preparation that they're putting in, especially the ones that are semifinals. Like, these 4 teams understand it. Weibo will be a huge question mark if they step up to Bilibili, and T1 versus JD Gaming. God, that's going to be awesome. Or I hope it's going to be awesome. But both of those teams show such solid understanding of preparation. And we probably wouldn't get this kind of level of preparation and flexibility if the patch had been like what it was last year. We're like, sure, last year there was a lot of things, but it felt stale in comparison. It's weird that there are less champions played this year, and it still feels fresher. And I don't really think that's 100% attributable to the different format. I 100% think that the ability to be so flexible on a game-to-game basis against so many different teams, because the patch allows it to be, and you're not like shoestringing random shit just to try to like beat what is the core understanding. Excellent. It's good. So I'm going to cap off this week's video with just like a question to all of you, right? How have you liked, or many questions, how have you liked so far the tournament? Are you in agreement with me? The expectations and the way that the meta feels is solid compared to other years. It feels fresher and a lot more flexible, despite like fewer champions having been played. If there's anything to expect, because I didn't talk about my predictions, because I feel like the predictions are a little bit harder to really flip. I think any choices on either direction that you choose makes sense. I still am hard, fast, and set that JD Gaming is probably going to win the whole thing, but it is so close that if they lose, I would not be surprised. Just quite honestly. And Bilibili versus Weibo. Weibo's wild ramblings are like the range at which they play their skills and how like volatile they usually are, and Bilibili's like intense approach to the game means that like I could see either way depending on how Weibo show up on that day. So I picked Bilibili and JD Gaming just because that feels like the direction that it's going. There's been too many of these best of fives, which makes the best of five at the finals super obvious, unfortunately. But it really could go in either of the 3 other directions. But I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you again for watching. Greatly appreciate it. And I'll see you all next week.